Good evening, everyone. My name is John Donnelly, and I am the chairman of the National Press Club's Press Freedom Committee. And by day, I'm a reporter for CQ Roll Call. I want to welcome you to tonight's event, which is entitled Double Exposure. And we're going to tell the story of how the Memphiss commercial appeal newspaper unearthed the extraordinary tale of Ernest Withers, who was a famous photographer of the civil rights movement and at the same time, an informant for the FBI. Tonight's event is brought to you by the Press Club's Press Freedom Committee and also by our Young Members Committee. The Press Freedom Committee, if I may just tell you for a moment, spearheads the Press Club's efforts to fight back against repression of the press, both here at home and abroad. And we also push hard to make sure that governments everywhere are as open to the public as possible. And if you're interested in joining the club or just learning more about us, the website is press.org. Now, tonight's event is especially timely because of what it says about how newspapers, even as their business models feel intense pressure, can still do public interest journalism that takes a long time and costs a bit of money. It's also timely because of what it says about the importance of freedom of information laws in that pursuit, and not least because it touches on government surveillance of citizens in a democracy, which is also a very timely subject. And we could not have a more perfect moderator for tonight's panel than Chuck Tobin, who is the gentleman sitting in the middle here. I'm going to introduce Chuck to you and get out of the way. Chuck's a former journalist who now chairs a nationwide team of media lawyers at the firm of Holland and Knight, and he's based here in Washington, D.C. Chuck's a member of the club's Press Freedom Committee. He's a former chair of the American Bar Association's and the D.C. Bar Association's media law committees. He was also lead counsel for the Memphiss commercial appeal in the litigation against the FBI over the Ernest Withers files. And that's all I have to say. So let me just be a smart guy and turn it over to the panel. Chuck?
Thank you, John. It's an honor and a privilege to be here, and we all give our thanks to the National Press Club's Freedom of the Press Committee and the Young Members Committee for hosting this panel. You see on the screens a picture of Ernest Withers. Ernest Withers, as John told you and as everybody who came here knows, Ernest Withers was a noted photographer in Memphis. And at the same time, thanks to the intrepid work of our panel member next to me, we also now know at the same time that he was given access and the trust of the leadership of the civil rights movement, he was also informing on the movement to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And that is the what, and there are a lot of questions about the why, questions you have, questions we have, questions that we want to find the answers to. And part of the panel discussion tonight is to focus on the story of who Ernest Withers was and why he became involved in the story in this particular way. But as my friends in print journalism would say, that's really just the main bar of this whole story. There are lots of sidebars. And tonight we're going to discuss some of those sidebars as well. There's the story of the Freedom of Information Act litigation that Mark and the Memphiss Commercial Appeal brought, and how the FOIA process really worked to our advantage to help tell this story. There's the story of the Scripps Company, the E.W. Scripps Company, which owns the commercial appeal. And as John noted in introducing me, in this day and age, it's highly unusual and indeed courageous for newspaper companies to be spending precious resources on investigations and litigation like this. And then finally, in any big story, there's a why do we care? There's a social and historical context. And we're going to delve into that context today and try and put Ernest Withers into part of the historical mosaic of what was going on in the FBI and in the civil rights movement during the 1960s and early 1970s. So to tell this story and to tell these sidebars, we've assembled a panel of direct players and other interested people. The most important player on the main bar of this story is Mark Pereskia with the Commercial Appeal newspaper. Mark's superb work is what told us all about Ernest Withers, and he's actually been pursuing this story, as he'll tell you, since 1997, which is a colossally long time for such a young journalist as Mark to have been pursuing this story, and he's done a very good job at that. Mark has been with the Commercial Appeal for 24 years. Prior to that, he did tours of duty in the newsrooms at the Duluth News-Tribune in Minnesota and the Bradenton Herald in Florida, and he's a proud graduate of the University of Minnesota. To my right is David Giles. Dave Giles is Vice President and Deputy General Counsel and Chief Ethics Officer at the E.W. Scripps Company. Dave is the secret weapon and best friend to all of Scripps newsrooms across its platform of 13 newspaper and 19 broadcast and the internet platform markets. He is the first call when journalists have a legal problem and a legal issue, and he counsels and helps them work through problems, and where appropriate, brings in outside counsel to help them get the news out. Dave is perfectly suited for that work because before he joined Scripps, in fact, before he became a lawyer, he was a reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer and USA Today, and so he feels their pain. He knows what they go through. And between his newsroom work and joining Scripps, he also was a very prominent litigation attorney here in the Washington, D.C. market. Also joining us today on my far left is historian David Garrow. David Garrow is both a historian and a Pulitzer Prize-winning author of the book Bearing the Cross, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, among other important works of history that he's written. He frequently writes on the civil rights movement for the New York Times, The Nation, the Financial Times, and the New Republic. And in addition to that print work, he was senior advisor to PBS for the award-winning series Eyes on the Prize, which documented a series of milestone events in the civil rights movement. He currently serves on the faculty of University of Pittsburgh, holding dual appointments in both law and the Department of History, and he's previously taught at a number of other esteemed institutions, including American University here in the Washington, D.C. area. And then finally, helping us round out the discussion, on my far right is Mizell Stewart, Vice President for Content with the newspaper group at E.W. Scripps. E.W. Scripps is based in Cincinnati. In that job, Mizell oversees the editors in Scripps' 13 newspaper platforms, helping them develop content strategy, news and information production across both their print and digital platforms. He came to that job at Scripps through Scripps' Evansville Courier and Press newspaper, where he was the editor for 5 years. Previous to that, he served editorial positions in the newsrooms at the Akron Beacon Journal and the Biloxi Sun Herald. And Mizell also led the team at the Tallahassee Democrat, but way back in the year 2000, over their award-winning coverage of the election recount in Florida, which is actually where I had the privilege of meeting and working with Mizell. And so we have with us a full panel of people ready to delve into all of the different stories and main bars and sidebars. And to start it all off, I thought maybe we would dress the table with the historical setting. And so let me ask David Garrow, we're here to talk about Ernest Withers and the FBI. Let's talk about the FBI first. What were they doing domestically in the 1960s?
I think the first thing to emphasize about the FBI's domestic security efforts in the 50s and 60s is that human informants were far and away the major building block. Back in those decades, electronic surveillance, either wiretaps or microphones, were exceptionally time-consuming and relatively expensive to operate. So it's only in relatively unusual cases with Dr. King, some of Dr. King's advisors, Elijah Muhammad, head of the Nation of Islam. Only in very unusual cases did the FBI go to the effort and the cost of mounting widespread electronic surveillance. So human informants were the bread and butter of the FBI's domestic security coverage, whether it's the American Communist Party, the Socialist Workers' Party, the Nation of Islam, the Civil Rights Movement. And agents in every office were tasked with recruiting human informants. And that tasking had a statistical, measure up element to it. Now, it bears emphasis, without treading on what Mark's going to talk about, that the vast majority of these human informants whom the FBI recruited were not paid. And certainly in a good number of civil rights movement instances, these individuals didn't realize that the Bureau viewed them and coded them in the FBI's numeric filing system as informants. And in multiple instances that I've encountered in years past, someone who was a minister in Montgomery, Alabama, would recall, oh yes, the FBI agents would come and talk to me every month or so about what was going on. And certainly in, say, the mid or late 1950s in the Deep South, a lot of people in the movement thought of the FBI as potentially helpful and supportive of the movement. They weren't at that time viewing the Bureau as this hostile force.
Well, indeed, we've all seen the film of federal agents helping to integrate the schools in the South against the resistance that was there. Where did this notion that the civil rights movement in the mind of the FBI posed some kind of a threat that needed surveillance, where did that come from?
J. Edgar Hoover's FBI had a fixation on communism and the American Communist Party going back to the 1930s and 1940s. By the late 40s, early 50s, the Bureau is extremely focused on the supposed danger of is the Communist Party infiltrating Black America, the Negro movement. And across the course of the 1950s, the FBI has a quite friendly relationship, for example, with the NAACP, major civil rights organization of that time. And so right up into the early 60s, it's only in the early 60s does it really come to be seen in Black America that the FBI's interest is problematic and potentially dangerous rather than helpful. But the Bureau's fear that the African American freedom struggle was vulnerable to manipulation by Soviet agents of influence, that's a hugely exaggerated but very constant theme coming right up across the whole decade of the 1960s.
So organizationally, was there a program of racial informants? Did it become a focus?
Initially, the Bureau has both security informants and criminal informants. Racial informants are then added, sort of broken off and expanded as a category. Those of us, myself and Mark, who've done a lot of work in FBI files, there are numerical designations. 170 becomes the FBI file category for racial informants. Previously, security informants were 134s. But it's the size of the program, just how many people were viewed as sources and informants by the FBI that needs to be stressed.
Mark, take us to Memphis with that national perspective. What was going on in Memphis within the FBI's racial informant program in the 60s?
Well, starting out in the early 60s, it was a very sleepy environment for on the civil rights trail. You had Memphiss is a small field office. They had basically two agents working, domestic intelligence, William Lawrence, who did it for decades there, and often younger agents who worked with him. In the early 60s, it was pretty much focused on communism. It was very much the Cold War. They were trying to investigate communist infiltration in, you know, the very small and struggling labor movement, and also within the NAACP. And as Professor Garrow said, I mean, you know, there was great cooperation among the leadership of the NAACP. We have no evidence that any of these individuals were paid, but they did meet regularly with the FBI. The FBI came and talked to them, and they cooperated. Kind of leaving the early 60s to the mid 60s, as the anti-war movement took off, you had a very flourishing peace movement in Memphis. Not a whole lot's been written about that, but there were big demonstrations. The FBI was very concerned about that.
Anti-war?
Anti-war, Vietnam War. You would have marches going, 5-mile marches going through you know, parts of Memphis right through downtown. Reverend James Lawson was very much involved in this. And then kind of taking you into the end of the 60s, as the elements of the civil rights movement became more radicalized, the focus kind of shifted then to militancy and black nationalism, this fear that, you know, there were separatist groups that wanted to overthrow the government. That was kind of fueling a lot of what the FBI was doing. And as I mentioned, Agent William Lawrence, he was a native of Ohio. He served 27 years in the FBI, 25 of them in Memphis. He got there in 1945, just as World War II ended. He was very much a Cold Warrior. I had spent a lot of time with his daughter. He's deceased now. And who was very helpful to me. He was very much the domestic intelligence agent. He had a subscription to the communist newspaper, the Daily Worker, under a very, very thinly veiled alias, William Harvey. His name was William Harvey Lawrence. And so, and he had a number of informants who he had recruited to help him in this endeavor. His crowning achievement was in 1954. There was an American Communist Party leader from North Carolina named Junius Scales, who had been indicted under the Smith Act, which had made it a crime to try to overthrow the government and also simply to be a member of the Communist Party. And Junius Scales was in hiding throughout the South. And through his network of informants, Lawrence determined that he was actually in Memphis and arrested him on a rainy night in Memphis in 1954. And his daughter, Betty, you know, shared with me these documents, which are online on our website. He got a personal letter of commendation from J. Edgar Hoover.
Wow.
Scales was the only American to ever go to prison simply for being a member of a political party.
Interesting.
He was a wonderful, sweet man. I knew him in North Carolina in the 1980s. And he's still when he's in federal prison, he's quit the party by the time they send him to federal prison.
Yeah, he's kind of had it. I think they'd outed Stalin by then, and they realized all the crimes, and he was very disillusioned by that.
All right, so we have the FBI looking for communists under every bed. They decide that they need to pay attention to the growing civil rights movement and the black empowerment movement in the South. We have Agent Lawrence in Memphis starting to show interest in that area and arresting suspected communists. Where does Ernest Withers come in? Who was he? Let's talk about that, Mark. Before we knew that he was an FBI informant, what do we know about Ernest Withers?
Well, Ernest was born in 1922 in Memphis. He grew up poor. His dad was a letter carrier, and his mom was a cleaning lady. And his opportunities at that time seemed very limited. He very much expected to follow his father in his footsteps and become a letter carrier himself. But early in life, he got interested in photography. His sister had given him a camera in high school, and he later served in the Army in World War II and had the good fortune of being assigned to a photography unit and where he learned how to shoot in the field and mix lab chemicals, and was on the side selling photographs to servicemen who would, you know, for like $1 or $2, and they would mail them back home, and he found that he could make a living at this. And so when he gets back to Memphis, he gets a loan through the GI Bill and opens a photography studio, and he eventually moves it to Beale Street, which, if any of you know Memphis, I mean, Beale Street is very well known. I mean, as a blues scene back in the time, it was really the hub of the black life in Memphis. You know, it was the whole business street. And he was a studio photographer. He took wedding pictures, baby pictures. He got to know everybody in town. And on the side, he had a large family. He eventually had 8 children. He started freelancing for the local paper, the Tri-State Defender, which owned by the Sengstack family out of Chicago, who also ran the Chicago Defender. And so this takes him to, the arc of his life gets to a point where he's a young man in his early 30s, raising a family, and the civil rights movement starts to blossom. And he starts getting these assignments from the Tri-State Defender, the Chicago Defender, and his pictures ran all over the country in various black newspapers.
Tell us about some of the pictures that we're going to display.
This first picture that you see here is from 1966. This is, this is well into the civil rights movement. He'd been working it for 10 years, starting with the murder of Emmett Till down in Memphis. He covered that trial down there. Ernest is the man with the big camera around his neck. That's a twins reflex camera. He had to actually look down through the top of it. I don't know if any of you ever did that. It's a clumsy, he used one of those pretty much throughout his career until later in life. But so Ernest is in the lead there. This really shows you the access that he had. He was very trusted. He knew all the leaders of the movement, both in Memphis and nationally.
Just identify some of the people.
You see Dr. King with the white short sleeves behind. There's Reverend James Lawson. He was the father of the nonviolent movement and actually moved to Memphis in 1963. He's the man with the dark shades on. Stokely Carmichael is the man with the head bowed kind of behind over Lawson's shoulder. And so Ernest is out shooting this picture. This was 1966. James Meredith had just been shot on this march against fear going through Mississippi. And he's in the hospital, and Dr. King takes it over. And so they're marching down to Jackson, Mississippi, and Ernest is there covering it, but as you can see, he kind of wears 2 hats. He's very, very familiar with everybody, and they like him, they trust him, and he's part of the group, really. This picture here is from 1956, and this was a year after the Emmett Till trial, and this was the Montgomery bus boycott, and the very young man you see looking out the window there with the felt hat on is Dr. King. I think he was 27 then, and of course Ralph Abernathy, his close friend, right next to him. Ernest took this picture on, he went down there. This was the day that the Supreme Court had ruled that desegregation on the buses down there was illegal, and Ernest got up bright and early in the morning, I think at 4 in the morning, and actually joked that Dr. King wasn't the first man to ride an integrated bus. He was, Withers, because he'd been riding the bus all morning waiting for Dr. King to show up. And he took, look at this the composition of this picture is amazing. I mean, it's, you see Dr. King and Abernathy in the foreground here, and you see the white gentleman in the background, actually in the back of the bus. And this picture when Ernest died in 2007 ran in the New York Times. I mean, this has been shown worldwide.
It was kind of the paparazzi of the movement down there.
Yeah, I mean, he was doing.
Now that I think about it.
Yeah, he was a freelancer. He was never on staff, but I mean, a lot of these seminal photos. He was there for a lot of these seminal events. Like the Emmett Till trial, the Montgomery bus boycott, the integration of Ole Miss. I mean, he was covering it all.
Let's take a look at some of his other work.
This is 1966 again. This is Dr. King at the Lorraine Motel. He was later shot and killed there 2 years later in 1968. Again, you see the access that Ernest had. Ernest did not inform on Dr. King day to day because Dr. King was based in Atlanta and Ernest was based in Memphis. And so, but when Dr. King came to Memphis, he did inform on him, and he would tell the FBI where he's staying, kind of what his movements were, who he was meeting with, that sort of thing.
About this one.
This photo here is the day before Dr. King's death, April 3rd, 1968, and if any of you have been to the Memphis airport, it kind of still looks the same. I mean, it's like you get under the portico there, and that's it's a little bigger now, but it looks basically the same.
So this is him arriving to participate.
This is, all right, the setting of this is Dr. King had been in and out of Memphis for 2 weeks prior to this. He had been invited to help assist, to help rally the city's garbage workers, the sanitation workers. They were striking, they were very oppressed, they were downtrodden. They worked for very low wages under very oppressive conditions, and Dr. King had a number of other things on his plate at the time. This is April of '68. He was organizing his Poor People's Campaign, the March on Washington, but took time to come here to Memphis and to support the Senate. And so and a week before this photo was taken, was a very pivotal moment because Dr. King was leading a march through Memphis down Beale Street, and at the back of the march erupted in a riot. So one of the first time, I think the first time that anything like that had happened, and the windows were broken, police responded with clubs and mace, and a young man, a teenager, actually died in the melee. I mean, he was shot and killed by police, and so, and Dr. King was just totally depressed over this thing. I mean, this was going to ruin his reputation. He was getting criticized all across the country, and he knew he had to come back to lead this peaceful march. And so, and Ernest is there, of course, the newsman that he is, to take the picture. This picture right here was taken the morning of that disastrous march. This is a very famous photo. A lot of people who study civil rights know this. It's the "I am a man" placards that the sanitation workers, they're dressed up in their Sunday best, ready to march through downtown Memphis. And Ernest actually helped design those placards. There's a little, he was, again, the dual roles that he served. He was a civil rights insider and a journalist who covered it. And but he had helped. I think he actually. I believe the story is that the pine boards attached to them, he had helped saw those up and had some role in actually designing the placards themselves.
There's actually some beautiful artwork and paintings that are based
right.
On this photo. And for a while there was a mural up here in downtown Washington on the side of a building with the "I am a man" poster. Yes, ma'am.
Well, glad to God that the artist has the "I am a man" and it's in the collection at the National Gallery of Art.
The woman in the audience just let us know that the National Gallery of Art has in its collection one of the paintings based on this photograph. Thank you for that. Let's take a look at one more.
This is late April 4th, 1968, or early in the next morning. This is outside Dr. King's room at 306 at the Lorraine. The dark kind of silhouette that you see, that's actually Dr. King's blood. Ernest, again, he knew Dr. King and his staff. They let him into his room. He shot a lot of pictures that night of Dr. King's staff, kind of intimate photos, and was out on the balcony that night. Dr. King had been standing along the railing here on the second floor of the Lorraine Motel when a sniper shot him and killed him. And so, no people in the picture, but yet it's a powerful picture,
Absolutely. All right, so Mark, this is and will always remain a big part of Ernest Withers' legacy, is that he was the leading documentary photographer of the civil rights movement, at least in Memphis, and arguably for much of the movement. How did you come to learn and suspect that there was more to the story of Ernest Withers?
Well, that takes us back to 1997, and I really haven't been working on the story that long, but it's kind of like I can't really get the story, but no, what was going on in 1997 is James Earl Ray, the convicted assassin of Dr. King, was still alive, and he was dying of liver disease and was trying to get out of prison, and he was floating a number of petitions in criminal court there. And his lawyer was coming up with a number of conspiracy stories, really trying to take the focus away from James Earl Ray, and came very, very close to actually, I think, securing James Earl Ray's release. At one point, his attorney got the King family to endorse his conspiracy stories, and Dr. King's son, Dexter, actually went to prison. I don't know if some of you might remember this, where James Earl Ray was staying in Nashville, shook his hand and said, "We believe you." And this picture went worldwide. I mean, it was just stunning. It was like, wow. So it was in that context that I contacted this old FBI agent who had been involved in the security investigations of Dr. King, and started talking with him. And he was a real crotchety old guy. I mean, I asked him about the conspiracy stuff, and he said, "That's all a bunch of bull." It's like you can't believe that. But really, and I had already surmised that. But what I really was interested in was the surveillance. What were they doing? How were they monitoring Dr. King? And then, because you always heard these stories, and Professor Garrow has written extensively about the electronic surveillance of Dr. King, but it always ended before Memphis. And so I was curious, was there any electronic surveillance of Dr. King in Memphis?
Sure.
And he says, no, absolutely not. We didn't do any. And so I said, well, what about photographic surveillance? And this is where he said, we didn't need photographic surveillance. He said, we had Ernest Withers. And that's how I first found out about Withers. And he actually went into some detail about, the informant coverage that, they had, I mean, and they did have Memphiss covered with informants. I mean, on a whole a spectrum of, from people who were just very low level, and most of these people weren't paid. There were only 5 what they called racial informants in Memphis in 1968 who were actually paid, and Ernest was one of them. But he kind of primed the pump at that time and said, that anybody who was anybody, he got pictures on, he got reports on, but he would never go on the record. He didn't want any of this tied to him in any way.
This is the FBI agent.
Yes, retired. And so there was nothing that I could do with it. In fact, he told me at one point that he says if I ever wrote about this, he'd deny it.
Okay.
So I was kind of stuck to a point where this whole James L. Ray stuff just died down, and the story ended, and I took my notes and tucked them away in boxes, and and really forgot about it until years later when Ernest died, and then when he passed on.
That's when you rekindled your interest?
Yeah, I said, well, I know he was an informant. I'd like to find out more, and I knew that your privacy rights are diminished after you die. That you always see when celebrities or important people die, there's always somebody filing a Freedom of Information request to find out what the FBI had on them. So I did that.
We're gonna talk about the process of the litigation in a moment, but let me just ask Professor Garrow, were there other people like Ernest Withers out there, and specifically in the racial informant category, and what motivated them in general, if you know?
The most important one, certainly in the King part of the story, was a fellow named James A. Harrison, who was the controller, the head finance man in the SCLC, Dr. King's organization. Now, the Bureau has never released any documents on Mr. Harrison. Mr. Harrison, as best I know, is still alive. And so the full story there, has not benefited from the sort of really thorough legwork that Mark and the Commercial Appeal have done on Withers. Harrison was paid, and I think in a majority of similar circumstances, I mean, Mark can talk about this with regard to Mr. Withers, the money involved was modest enough that it was attractive, but money alone at that time was not a motive for being an FBI informant. I think for the majority of such people, it was the pleasure, the adrenaline of playing secret agent man, of thinking that you were, playing detective. And having a privileged secret role. So I think there's a sort of the psychological rewards of being an informant, being a source. There was another gentleman who was very active in a variety of ways around the movement. J. Richard Kennedy actually hosted the national television broadcast the day of the March on Washington with the leaders of the march. Kennedy was talking regularly to the Central Intelligence Agency. They were taking his musings about the meaning of the movement all too seriously. So I think for some of these individuals, thinking that they had the ear of the FBI or the ear of a part of the CIA, again had a sort of ego reward or ego boost to tell them how important they were.
Interesting. Let me turn now to Mizell, and Professor Garrow has talked about how having the ear of the FBI was something of interest. How did Mark get the ear, and what would get the ear of the Scripps Company to give him the leeway to pursue a story like this he's about to tell us the whole story, but he's been pursuing it pretty much doggedly since 2008 and even before that. It's a 40-year-old confidential informant. Isn't that old news?
Well, think about it in the context of some of the things Mark shared about Ernest Withers, an important local figure, a studio on Beale Street. Everybody in Memphis knew Ernest Withers, and particularly everybody in Black Memphis, a trusted figure. And for years, his participation as the photojournalist who chronicled the movement, made him a famous person in that community. And so the idea that Withers may have also been an informant for the FBI and contributing information and surveillance on Dr. King, an explosive story and a timeless story in many respects. And when you put it in a present-day context, the federal surveillance of private citizens is an explosive story no matter what. And so even years after the fact, and that coupled with Mark's persistence and his reporting instincts really got that story on the radar screen for us.
We've actually talked in the litigation about how this resonates and have passed as prologue with the current surveillance, domestic surveillance operations. How can we really understand what our government is doing now if we don't understand the history and kind of examine it in that context? And so there's a...
Well, absolutely. I mean, we've seen in recent months the extensive reporting on NSA electronic surveillance, but to David's point earlier, that in the 60s it wasn't as much about electronic surveillance as much as it was about relationships and about human intelligence. And so the story of how the FBI cultivated those relationships and created that network of informants. And the only way to get that story was through the records compiled by the FBI.
David Giles, you had to green light, if you will, the legal aspect of Mark's work. It costs money, it costs resources. You probably get a lot of requests from Scripps to launch expensive litigation.
This one, I get a lot of requests on a fairly regular basis, and this one, we knew it was going to be an uphill battle. We're taking on the FBI. The FBI is an organization that in FOIA litigation does not often lose. It's one of the frequent winners. But we felt, just like the compelling story that Mark's told, that we had a compelling legal story to tell as well that was different than your normal FOIA litigation. First of all, we had the compelling story. We had Mark's legwork. We had an informant who was no longer alive, and that, as Mark discussed a little bit earlier, addressed some of the privacy concerns and other open records concerns. There was no reason any longer to withhold this for criminal investigative purposes. The FBI usually, when they prevail in these cases, they can hang their hat, so to speak, on the fact that they're protecting life, liberty, safety, happiness in the United States, and they're conducting legitimate law enforcement investigations. But we felt this one was a little bit different and a little bit unique.
And so, Mark, you did some initial legwork. You did some initial looking into this. There came a point where you felt comfortable going to print, and it was just before we actually launched the litigation.
Right.
Tell us where you reached that trigger point.
Well, it started with a Freedom of Information request, and I had rather, naively said in my request I wanted his informant file, but at that time, of course, they weren't even acknowledging that he was an informant. But
this is right after he died,
this
right?
is right after, months after he died. He
2008.
He died in October of 2007. I filed the request in February of 2008. Okay. So it took about a year to get something back. And so what it was not anything to do with him being an informant. In the meantime, what had happened with Ernest, after the civil rights era waned, he got a patronage job working for the state of Tennessee as essentially a state policeman, a state liquor agent, and he got caught up in a public corruption probe. He'd actually gone to prison. He was involved with this cabal of corrupt people in the Ray Blanton administration. I mean, they were selling pardons and clemencies for people like murderers, robbers, really severe offenders. I mean, they would anywhere from $10,000 to $80,000 you could get out of prison. I eventually got these records about Ernest. They came out in batches over time, but I mean, we got him on tape. his phone was tapped, and he was very much involved in this letting inmates out of prison for cash. They called it for the clemency for cash.
And so how did that fit in? How did that turn you on to the
Well, so
story
I
here?
had some records to work with, and this took about a year after I got it. And this body of records that I got initially, I mean, it's hundreds of pages, but initially they only gave us like 115 pages. And it was in the course of that they were investigating Ernest. Christine, if you go to the next slide, you'll see this. And this report from 1977 was part of that investigation. And if you look at the very bottom down there, this is essentially what I call like a background report. It isn't strictly that, but it gives you background information on Ernest. And what it says here is Ernest Columbus Withers was formally designated as ME338R. And it goes on to say, CI. Well, they say just a little bit of information is dangerous. In this case, I'd studied this stuff enough. I recognized that number as being an informant number, what they call a source symbol number. And actually, the ME, that prefix there, stands for Memphiss. 338 was the unique number that he was assigned. Any informant, they'll do it sequentially. And so whether you're a criminal informant, a security informant, racial informant, whatever, you're going to get a number, and it's uniquely assigned to you. And the R, that suffix, that was peculiar to the time, designating him as a racial informant. And so, so I had what I thought was a loaded gun. At that point, I mean, I knew that, all right, what this guy had told me years earlier is true. That he was.
You found this buried, just to be clear, buried in the box of documents for another investigation that involved Ernest Withers?
Well, I got it in the FOIA release, the first FOIA release on Ernest, and so I knew I had some traction here. There's something to go with. And so what to do with it? I mean, I couldn't just go write a story that he was an informant. It really, would raise more questions than. So and the FBI wasn't going to cooperate. So what I was kind of left with doing was, I knew that there were other records out in the public domain that had been released years earlier. The FBI's file on the Memphis sanitation worker strike, and also their 2-3 year investigation of the Invaders, which was a black power group in Memphis, styled after SNCC or the Black Panthers. They these files ran like 7,000 pages, and I knew there was a college professor who had them out east. I contacted him. I got them. They were sitting in a basement. Got him to mail it to him. All these boxes come in, and I just start going through it, one by one, until I start getting hits. And what the FBI did. What the FBI did is they actually failed to redact that source symbol number, the ME338R. They should have done it, but the thing is that if anybody who's been a reporter, people make mistakes, and so they failed to redact it repeatedly. And so in these older documents that were released in the 70s, sanitation worker strike and the Invaders, I kept finding that number repeatedly, and you could pinpoint specific. You can just when you see that number, you can just substitute in the name. It's just code, and so you could say like the first hit that I got was a teletype that the Memphis field office sent to headquarters in Washington right after Dr. King had died, and they reported that they had an informant at Dr. King's funeral in Atlanta, and that the informant was reporting that a couple of Dr. King's aides were coming back to Memphis to resume their support of the sanitation strike. And that was big news for the FBI because they didn't want trouble. They didn't want outside agitators coming in. And the source on the document was ME338R. And so this is part of the construction of this. The number fits, it's Withers. I knew that Withers was in Atlanta. I knew that he covered the funeral. He shot pictures of Dr. King's coffin, pictures of his widow, Coretta. He was there. And so we kept getting things like this. So another example is in November of '68, some campus radicals and militants take over the administration building at Lemoyne-Owen College in Memphis. And the FBI's report on it is got ME338R all over it. They actually have an index. A lot of these big reports will have an index, and they'll tell you like source 1 is so-and-so, and it's redacted, and source 2 is so-and-so, and source 3, in this case, they failed again to redact ME338R, so I know it's Withers. And he's in the building and providing all kinds of information back to the FBI. And independently of that, the news coverage of the time, it became clear that Withers, people saw Withers go into the building. And so I mean, I've got multiple points of corroboration on this.
This document became important in the litigation along with the last one. What is this particular document?
This was a search slip that the FBI released at one time or another. I don't recall exactly when, but it added to our ammunition in litigation. Is that he was at one. Let's see, what is that dated? 78. Okay, so he was under investigation by the FBI for public corruption at that time, and somebody requests, they want to see what files they've got on him. This went to Washington, and so all those numbers you see there are different, serials and files that they've got, and then at the bottom you see the confidential informant designation, which, again, is another point of corruption. So we're building toward this story that we eventually did run. I'm not sure if that's the next slide or not. Yes, it is. Okay, so this is September of 2010. We still have no confirmation from the FBI, in terms of them saying that, articulating it orally that he's an informant. But we have plenty of records and other things, and so we run this very long. It's a 7-page expose that ran in the paper. That basically, and we were able to say in detail things that he had done for the FBI, at least from 68 to 70, because we didn't have his informant file, so we didn't know the full story of what it was. We followed this up, I think, with another, I'm not sure if, this is December, okay, this was December, we did another, and basically installment. This was about 5 pages in the newspaper. But at this point, I had contacted Betty Lawrence, Agent Lawrence's daughter, and she shared with me a number of personal artifacts that he had, including handwritten notes that he'd saved and she saved. And she kept telling me over the phone, you've already proven this. You don't need anything more. But these handwritten notes are just so interesting because, and the part of them you can see there, but they refer to Ernest both by name and by his informant number. And at the time that Agent Lawrence wrote these notes, Congress was reinvestigating Dr. King's assassination. This was 1978. Agent Lawrence got called before the Select Committee on Assassinations to testify publicly, and what he says in the notes and what we now know and believe is that Ernest was called to testify in secret in closed session, and that's what this is about, his panic about,
Agent Lawrence was helping calm him down and prepare him.
Yes. He actually coached him on what to say.
Right. And you got access to those notes through his
Betty,
daughter,
right,
who kept them literally in a shoebox.
Exactly. These notes are online, by the way, too. They're, I was in her home scanning all this stuff. It was
all of Mark's work and resource materials, you can find them all on the Commercial Appeals website. It's wonderful if you want to see actually how he pieced this whole story together. Maisel, let me ask you this. There's a certain courageousness just in facing a community like Memphis with a story like this. Ernest Withers was a local hero, and this, in some ways, casts him certainly in a very different light. Was there concern? Is there concern about how the story plays in the Memphis community?
Well, there was certainly concern and a bit of a backlash, certainly from the Withers family, over the work that Mark had done, and you always consider the impact of that reporting on those close to the subject of the reporting. That said, what you have is this very detailed paper trail, and we're talking about the paper trail that Mark discovered even before the lawsuit is pursued to try to open up the entire file for from the FBI. And so but putting Withers in the context of his times, I think is really the challenge in a story like this, and telling the full story about Ernest Withers, both his work for the FBI, but also what he did for the movement as a photojournalist. His efforts really shed light and gave real insight and a real human sense to the civil rights movement. And so giving his photographs wider distribution, I think, has really helped humanize not only him, but shed a different light on those involved in the movement.
Mark, did you interact with the Withers family? Did you try and source the story with them?
Yeah, I did. They were when the story came out. I mean, they were very disturbed by the story. Ernest's daughter said she'd never heard this in her life, and at one point they actually said that basically said I made this up. But Ernest was a huge figure in Memphis. I mean, there's a building named after him on Beale Street, and he has a brass blues note in the sidewalk there, which is the equivalent to the Hollywood Star there. I mean, he's very well known, very well liked, and he truly was a real nice guy. I mean, anybody who ever met him, I mean, he was just so pleasant and charming that you would just kind of, juxtaposing the two things, this other side that is hidden there, and the criminal prosecution, they just don't seem to add up. But Ernest was very well liked, and there was a lot of a range of reaction to it.
David, did you meet him when you were working on your book?
Yes,
I thought so.
I have a very clear memory of Mr. Withers coming up to me after I'd spoken in Memphis sometime in the early 1980s, and he was at this event taking pictures. And I remember speaking with him, and I remember very clearly him handing me his business card, which at that time was on bright yellow cardstock. I still have it. But as Mark says, it's just one, very small, tiny illustration of what a sort of easygoing and ubiquitous figure he was. But as the, Tennessee gubernatorial Blanton administration corruption story tells, as well, Withers had a double-sided life. He had this wonderful record of achievement as a movement photojournalist, and then he has this secret relationship with the FBI and this deeply corrupt role years later.
Yeah, an interesting and complicated picture. And so, Dave, the newspaper decided that Mark had taken his story as far as he could without the litigation. You all decided to launch into this. What were some of the factors going through your mind as far as the challenges?
Well, I think the challenges were the fact that the FBI had the full resources of the government behind it, and we did not, and that there were some exceptions in the FOIA law that are often interpreted in favor of the government, and so those were some challenges that we thought we would have to surmount. But Mark is persistent, as you've all, I'm sure, been able to cull from this conversation so far. And after much conversation, we decided that it was worth filing the lawsuit to see if we could shake loose some of the information that Mark was seeking.
All right, we put up, not to bore you all with too much law school detail, but we put up on the screen a couple of provisions that played very heavily in the FOIA litigation. Both of those deal with confidential informants.
Right.
Dave, talk about the first exemption.
Well, the first one is essentially an exemption for law enforcement records for which there's a legitimate purpose to keep from public view.
So FOIA gives you a right to government documents, but it has 9 large exemptions, and this is part of one of them.
Right.
And as Dave said, it's for confidential informants. So you had an express exemption.
Correct.
Facing you.
Correct. But we felt that, as I had discussed earlier, some of the uniqueness about this case, the fact that Mr. Withers was no longer alive, the compelling nature of the story, the public interest, we might be able to make a persuasive case that the exemption wouldn't apply.
Okay. Now, we originally were going to do a balanced discussion of this because we invited and they accepted the FBI to join us. Unfortunately, the shutdown interceded, and we could not have somebody to speak for the FBI here today. So let me just ask very generally, Professor Garrow, you're involved in a lot of these cases. You study a lot of FOIA litigation. what is the general case the FBI makes for historically keeping confidential informants secret?
The Bureau, as you've touched upon, has a raft of these citations in the federal statute that allows them to withhold or redact material. B1, this B7D. But the Bureau generally has adopted a stance of withholding not just all informant identities, but all information supplied by informants. Even if the informant is the, Albany, Georgia chief of police, for example. Now, in certainly one very famous instance, and there are others, but let me just use one as an example, Jack and Morris Childs, the FBI's most valuable informants of all time, codenamed Solo, who were the financial couriers between the American Communist Party and the Soviet Union. Knew the leadership of the Soviet Union, knew the leadership of Communist China, and were working for the FBI for 25 plus years. Now, once the story of the Childs brothers was publicly revealed, these were super important informants, the Bureau made the policy decision that this reflected so well on the FBI that all the documents over time, still going on, have been disgorged. So one can look, many of these are on the web, one can go back and look at what the Childs brothers were doing in the 1950s, traveling to Moscow at the joint behest of the American Communist Party and the FBI. So there's a double standard here. That's what I want to emphasize, is that the Bureau will make the decision in some cases to move from a protective to a reputation burnishing approach. But with an Ernest Withers, with a Jim Harrison, the informant within Dr. King's organization, unsurprisingly, the Bureau makes the decision that these sorts of recruitments might not reflect so well on the FBI.
Okay, and that takes us back to the litigation, actually. The FBI didn't only refuse to give any information, any of the documents about Ernest Withers, they refused to admit or deny that he even was an informant. And we had a little surprise in the middle of the litigation that kind of explained the legal basis for that.
Yes. They cited, it was a hard-fought litigation. It went over 18 months, and as usual, they threw the kitchen sink at us. But the surprise that Chuck's talking about was they cited an exclusion 2C, which essentially allows the government to deny that something exists if it has to do with the request for an informant's, a request submitted via an informant's name or their personal identifier. And so, we were challenged with that exclusion. But fortunately for us, it had sort of an exemption within it that said that this section would not apply if the information had been officially corroborated. And so we focused our efforts as far as the litigation went on arguing that it had been officially corroborated, as well as some other arguments we put up along the way.
And so how do we back up our argument on this official corroboration or official confirmation?
Well, we went back to the document that we saw earlier and we highlighted earlier where you see Mr. Withers referred to as a former informant. It gives his number as ME 338-R. And so we cited that, and we also cited the fact that in filing a response, I believe the FBI also submitted that informant number as well. So there were two examples where it had been, the identity had been, quote unquote, in our minds, officially confirmed.
And the FBI actually made the argument that this was not official confirmation, that it was Mark kind of putting things together, and therefore that's not official. So we went to hearing on that narrow issue.
Yes.
The issue we framed for the judge was, did the FBI, quote, already officially confirm? And what was the judge's reaction?
Well, Judge Jackson, in a number of instances, ruled in our favor and was one of the reasons that there were points along the way during the 18 months when the legal fees are getting high and we're not making a lot of progress, but we would get these rulings along the way that would encourage us that we were making an impact. And in one particular motion ruling, she ruled that exemption C2 or exclusion C2, which I just talked about, did not apply. Obviously, the FBI had argued that it did apply, but she agreed with us, essentially saying that the FBI's position trying to protect this information, despite the fact that they were not protecting a living informant, they were not protecting a danger or a harm, and they were not avoiding details of an ongoing investigation. In essence, she found that they were protecting the government and others from embarrassment, and that wasn't sufficient enough to trump the exclusion.
One of my favorite lines in that decision also, it's a nice published decision, is that with regard to their argument that this was not official confirmation because it had too much information redacted to be official, she said that was not worthy of serious consideration. That it was very clear to her. And so with C2 out of the way, just the way this works is the FBI was now required, and the judge basically declared he was a confidential informant. They were required to admit it, and then to litigate the rest of the case with us, they were required to index the file and provide us with an index to the file. And the FBI does not like to even admit that there are confidential informants out there, let alone give you an index to the file, which is the way you fight document by document with the government. And so that became kind of a watershed moment for us in the litigation. So we didn't actually go to a final decision, go to the mat finally, on the ultimate issue of whether we get the files. What happened?
Well, what happened was the government, after the ruling that I just described, the FBI filed a motion for reconsideration, and they filed several motions. And Judge Jackson finally, I think, became exasperated with their reluctance not to follow her orders, and she called a status conference. I was not there, Chuck was there, so he can provide a lot more of the elaborate details. But she made it very clear that the government had to comply with the order to supply the Vaughn Index. And she also raised the question that perhaps we ought to try and resolve this on our own instead of having her do it. And I know this is a little bit tedious, but I'm gonna read a portion of the hearing towards the end where she is addressing the lawyers, and she says, maybe all this information is exempt, maybe the information is not exempt. In all likelihood, some of it is and some of it isn't. So the question I have for you today is, who is going to make that decision? Does it make sense for it to be the two of you instead of me talking to the two lawyers? I'm going to set another status hearing in a month to get the answer. In the meantime, I encourage you to take this back to your respective clients so that you can report back to me the answer to my original question, which is, would this case benefit from mediation? So clearly we got the hint as to what the judge wanted to do. And the interesting thing is that we had actually started out seeking mediation in the beginning, and the FBI flatly refused.
And the color I'll add to this is, first of all, that hearing that he's quoting from was on the anniversary of the I Have a Dream speech, which was not lost on the judge. She noted the irony of this. And second of all, the FBI, in order to continue to block documents entirely, would have to now prove that this was a legitimate law enforcement investigation. And she said rather incredulously, does the FBI really want to take the position that the surveillance of Dr. King was a legitimate exercise of law enforcement authority. And she then launched into the Solomonic statement that, you know, I'm going to rule half a loaf for some, you all ought to take it back. Didn't take us long to get to the mediation table after that.
It did not.
Yeah, the FBI showed a real quick willingness. And so what happened next?
So we had the mediation. We had a couple of meetings with a magistrate and pretty quickly reached terms of an agreement in which the National Archives and Records Administration would release documents to Mark that had been accessioned to them from the FBI. It gave Mark the ability to identify 70 files from which he could obtain request documents. And from, I guess, the corporate perspective, they also offered to pay some of our fees.
So Mark, what was it like sitting in a federal magistrate judge's office looking at a secret list of FBI files and being told you could pick 70 of them and go home?
Well, actually, it was kind of fun. I look
Yeah?
back at that moment very fondly, sitting around the table with, there were 2 lawyers from the FBI, 2 from the Department of Justice, you and me, so, and the magistrate. But, yeah, no, the 70 files really speaks to what a prolific informant Ernest Withers was, because this list they gave us was not all inclusive, and we don't even know. Some of these files, as I understand it, have not yet been accessioned to the National Archives, and so there are some that they're holding on to. We don't know what they are, but they have essentially laid down a list of case files that he'd worked on, that there were Withers-related materials on, ranging from like the NAACP, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. They did an extensive investigation of the SCLC, Dr. King's executive staff, his close people, and Withers was very much involved in that. On and on. I mean, and I got to pick, you know, I got to pick 70 of them, you know, and that's what we did. But I mean, it speaks to what a prolific informant he really was.
Kid in a candy store. It was really,
Yeah, I remember you were sitting there watching me go through
Quite a
list,
moment.
watching paint dry on the walls.
Well, no, it was very exciting. You were finally getting information
Well, that's
after
true.
years and
That's
years,
true.
and it was very exciting. Let me take a real quick detour to just give a shout out. They were not able to help us in the Withers lawsuit, but Dave alluded to our attempt to mediate the case before we ever went to litigation. The Office of Government Information Services is part of the National Archives and Record Administration. Their director was supposed to be here. She's also furloughed out of being here tonight, Miriam Nesbitt. But I just wanted to mention for the journalists and the civilians in the audience, OGIS is an office that was founded early in the first Obama administration. It provides counseling and dispute resolution for citizens. It was part of the Obama initiative toward transparency. We can talk about how transparent the administration is in another panel. But these are good folks in this office who really are there for you to reach out to and to try and help you get recalcitrant agencies to give you their documents. That's their website at the bottom. If we could just take a look at the next slide, just to show you, there are over 650,000 FOIA requests each year. 2,000 of them are brought to OGIS for assistance, and OGIS also counsels about 1,000 people a year, just in general on the process. So just a quick shout out to our good friends at OGIS who are waiting for your calls. All right, so Mark, you got this information. You got you were the kid in the candy store, and the cache of candy came in. Was it worth it?
Oh, definitely, definitely. So we've learned so much about what, even though it was a compromise that we reached, and it's amazing that you still can compromise in life, and maybe some folks here in Washington might want to think about that. But, I mean, compromises can work out, and this worked out for the government in that it didn't set any, case law. That it was done as a settlement that's off the books, so you can't rely on this to build upon it. But it worked out for us because we got I don't know all these records, but their key selling point. Betsy Shapiro from the Department of Justice, the first thing she said is that she says, we can continue to litigate this, and we will. We're prepared to appeal. He said, but the one thing you're going to get out of this settlement that you wouldn't get even if you took this all the way to Supreme Court is photographs. And Ernest Withers was a photographer, And the way it's interesting learning this protocol of how they do things, but the way the FBI files things is if you have an informant who's taking pictures, they're not filed in the informant file, they're filed in the case file. And so under this deal, we got access to the case file, Withers related materials in the case files. The deal was they couldn't redact his name, they couldn't redact his informant number, they had to provide, and we worked this out in the settlement where they had to give us actual photographs, not photocopies of it, back and front, and we even had spelled out, the pixels or whatever, just to make sure that they were publishable, and so. One of the first things that we learned in this settlement is, they had to give us a statement of, because we're never going to get the file, we're never going to get any assignments that he got, any written reports that he did. We're not going to know specific pay records, but when we worked out the settlement is that they were required to tell us the outline. How long did he work? He first started working for them in 1958 and ended in 1976. The relationship ended then. It was shortly before he was indicted. He was paid, and this is interesting too, so listen to this full thing. I mean, he was paid over the course of that time, authorized to be paid $20,088. Not a huge amount of money, but think about it on a couple of levels. First, in today's money, that's about $130,000. But then think too that most of the people who cooperated with the FBI got paid nothing, zero. And so he was actually very well compensated by in their world. We don't know exactly when that pay came. We suspect that most of it came in this very prolific period when, Memphiss started, all hell started breaking loose in Memphis. You had the sanitation worker strike, Dr. King getting shot there. You had, the SCLC coming back time and time again, leading, strikes against the hospital, to unionize the hospital and desegregation strikes. And so he became very, very useful then. But he was useful to them throughout that whole, that whole arc. And there's different phases of his informant work. Like in 58 to 61, it's still pretty much unknown what he was doing for them. I have not seen any records from that period yet. I do know that it shows up in some of these records that Ernest had a 137 file, which would make him at one point a criminal informant, straight up criminal informant, somebody who would, rat in somebody who was doing things illegally. So I suspect that that's probably what was going on in that early period, but then he starts becoming a political informant, and starting in 61, the records that we've got so far, and we're going to get these records over the course, we're getting them in batches over 2 years. So, and we've got a whole bunch so far, but there's a lot more we haven't seen. But so far, he starts becoming a political informant in 1961, and what you had going on then, the Nation of Islam had opened a mosque in Memphis. They became active in the South, and that just really concerned the FBI. You had the civil rights movement was gearing up. I mean, you had sit-in protests and some mass marches in Memphis for desegregation. You also had, they were sending Ernest out into the hinterlands because you had these, what they called tent city operations, where sharecroppers who had been kicked off their land either by mechanization or by, trying to register to vote. They were basically living like political refugees, like something out of John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, and there were the outside agitators who were coming into the camps from the north and from Memphis that the FBI viewed very suspiciously as being socialists, communists, leftists, and that's what they got Ernest to report on that. And so he morphs from probably a criminal informant to a political informant in the mid-60s. He's like reporting very intensively on the peace movement. And then toward the end, it's the whole militancy, the Black nationalist movement, and so it's interesting too that and the kind of the different roles that he served too that are becoming clear in these years, that he was an intelligence gatherer. He got information about strategy meetings that he passed on to them, passed on leaflets, financial reports. In a lot of cases, like phone numbers, things that helped them. He also helped them catalog the movement, which is interesting because of him being a photographer. He was able to go out and get a lot of group pictures.
Let's take a look at some of the pictures.
Well, here, go back 1 second if you don't mind, because I know I'm kind of rambling on here, but this, was Ernest's imprint, and his slogan was "Pictures tell the story." And was it on the
Wonderful.
card,
yes,
David?
yes, yes.
That's wonderful.
Ernest actually has 3 coffee table style picture books that I believe one of them is called Pictures Tell the Story. But this was his imprint that showed up on the back of. This is one of the reasons we wanted, you know, and to stipulate in the settlement, we want the front of the photo and the back of the photo. And so, and here before they made him ME330R, that imprint kept showing up. This picture here is taken in 1964 from the first mosque on Beale Street. They'd actually opened, the Nation of Islam had opened a mosque in '61 and had been active there, but you know, Ernest had a studio right down the street, and he went down there and took this picture. What he would do is he'd get the picture and he'd get as much information. You can just almost imagine, you know, journalists, you know, when you go out, or if you're a photographer, what's your name, what's your occupation, you know, and he would do all this under the cover of being a journalist. And they would write down, I believe that's Agent Lawrence's handwriting on the back, and Ernest might have told him, I don't know, but he would get their names, addresses when he had them, ages, occupations, a lot of times nicknames, and they would write all this, and sometimes they would cut these photos up as they needed to, like for mug shots or whatever, to put into individual, if they were keeping a file on an individual. And so, you know, that was his role as cataloging and inventory and helping them identify, you know, the who's who, really, of these movements.
Let's take a look at this next image. There's an interesting story here.
Okay. Well, this takes us to the investigation of the FBI's investigation of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. The FBI, for some reason or another, and I'm talking about the FBI's Memphiss field office, they were never deeply concerned about Dr. King. They opened a file on him in 1965, and it's thin. I mean, I've got it. There's some interesting things in there, but we won't go into that now. But they were very disturbed with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and it had to do with that whole period from 1967 when Dr. King came out against the war, and he was viewed as this very dangerous radical. People don't think of that now, but I mean, he was viewed as a militant, and a lot of the people around him, you know, he's having meetings with Stokely Carmichael, people on his staff, Jesse Jackson, they view as being very militant, a lot of the activists in Memphis, and so it's in that context that the Memphis field office really starts zeroing in on him. Him and his executive staff keep coming back to Memphis, and then they have that big riot there. And Dr. King, trying to shore up, you know, and have a peaceful march, is starting to meet with some of the local militants. And his only objective is to try to get them on board. We need a peaceful march, and he starts cutting deals with them. I mean, essentially what he's doing, he's talking with them in Lorraine, really in the hours before he's shot, and you know, he's saying that we'll make you parade marshals for the next march here, and we'll also, when we go to Washington, you will be, you know, involved in the security there. And after Dr. King was shot, the invaders, and this activist named Sweet Willie Wine became the police of Resurrection City. But so they're working out this deal, and the SCLC keeps coming back to Memphis after Dr. King is shot, and they have their annual convention in August of '68 there, and these young militants storm the convention. And they come in with they've got some kind of flag with them, and they're just, they really take it over, and they confront Andrew Young and Ralph Abernathy, and they say, you know, Dr. King made all these promises to us, and we want to get paid for it. And under pressure, they wrote out a check. And it's kind of interesting, the urban myth of this, that I've been talking to different people, is that the way that activists remembered is that it was for $10,000, and that Dr. King wrote it out for them, you know, in the hotel, you know. Like, but when you work through the story, and here's the actual picture, they got Withers to go take a picture of this check. It was for $500, and David, Professor Garrow, actually helped me through this, because when I was interviewing Andrew Young on this, you can't read who signed that check, and he's going, I don't know anybody. Andrew Young saying, no, there's nobody who fits that description. Professor Garrow's got a photographic memory. It's Cirillo McSwain, and that's
McSween, yes.
McSween, yes.
Who was that, Dave?
He was a, you know, lesser figure within the SCLC world. You know, someone who emerges, you know, as a more prominent figure in the organization after Dr. King's death. You know, when Ralph Abernathy has succeeded King. But again, this is, you know, it's wonderful, you know, how all of these documents and images show just how broad a coverage Mr. Withers was giving the FBI, not just of, you know, SCLC, but the local black militants in Memphis. It's the breadth of coverage that the FBI had in city after city after city of all sorts of social, political protest activism in the late 60s going into the early 70s.
Let's take a look at some more of what Ernest was documenting.
You all recognize this man.
Maybe they won't because he looks so young there.
He does. He's very young there. He's wearing a denim jacket. This clearly was taken. The date on this, I'm not sure that came through. It looks like a Polaroid, but one of the things that we understand they did is that Ernest would go out and take pictures of individuals, and then the FBI, for some reason, would take another Polaroid of the picture. Why they would do that, who knows? But that was their copy of it. But this is during the Poor People's Campaign. They're organizing poor people in Mississippi to march to Washington, and the FBI. A lot of times you wonder, so, well, what,
We should say this is Andy Young.
Andy Young,
Yeah,
exactly.
just so people aren't in mystery.
But why would they take a picture of Andy Young? There's millions of pictures of him, and so, but why? But one of these things that the FBI did was kind of this vacuum cleaner approach. They just take so much stuff because they didn't know when they'd need it. And this is a very interesting picture. I love this picture, and take a good look at this. This is Father Charles Mahoney. This was taken in 1968. And in the context of today, you might think, well, wow, was he under investigation for some, as a predator or something? No, it had nothing to do with it. His only crime was freedom of expression and association. Really, is what it is. He was he and some other priests were part of this Paulist order at St. Patrick's Catholic Church in downtown Memphis. And they had an outreach ministry to some of the black militants who actually had an office right near them and would let them share office space. They were very sympathetic to the sanitation workers' strike, the movement. They were anti-war. And the FBI started looking at these priests very suspiciously. They kept he had a colleague, Father William Greenspun, who I've found now I haven't seen the file yet, but they kept a file on him. And this picture here wound up in the FBI wanted a picture of all these guys. They got pictures of all these priests, and this one wound up in the invaders file. But they haven't tapped it yet. But they had a file on Father William Greenspun, who's now passed on. So I mean, this is interesting. The lengths that they were willing to go to investigate this. This photo here is from 1962, and this was when they dispatched Ernest into the tent city camps. This man on the right is an activist. I don't think he's very well known. I think his name is Weinberger, but he came down from Connecticut to basically was seen as an outside agitator. He was helping some of the women in the camp make leather bags. They call them tote bags for integration. Yeah. But he was also connected to I believe it was CORE, the Congress for Racial Equality. The FBI, local FBI, viewed that very jaundicely. They wanted, he had gone to jail. He just bailed, in this photo, he just bailed out of jail for speeding, and he refused to pay his ticket for some reason. But the FBI wanted photos, wanted information on it. And it's interesting, too, that they specifically sent Ernest into these camps under the cover of him as a journalist. They noted in the reports, and this is where you see, said that Agent Lawrence is writing this, that Withers is a commercial photographer, self-employed. He has credentials for Jet Magazine, a Johnson Publishing Company publication. He previously has done picture stories for Jet in both Fayette and Haywood counties, and was the first newsman to do stories in Fayette County regarding the tent city. He says, thus he would have logical entree and pretext to make inquiries around the current tent city, and they were inquiring about some people connected to the Socialist Workers' Party. Fantastic. And so that's, and it's interesting too, and we'll talk about this photo in a second here, but similarly, as the peace movement geared up there, they sent Mr. Withers out again, and in a report related to that, they noted that Withers, quote, has a press card for Jet Magazine and another for the Tri-State Defender. He said he's agreed to cover the proposed march. Withers agreed that he would cover this posing as a newsman, but would be alerted to photograph every participant in the march, including identification type photos with good facial views. And that day, the file showed the report that they filed that day, he added pictures to 5 new files and 16 existing files. So,
Wow.
this
Tell us about this one.
All right, this photo right here, the man in the center, the man with the beard and balding is James Bevel of Dr. King's executive staff. This was taken March 20th, 1968, about 2 weeks before Dr. King's assassination in Memphis, and this is that period of time when they're very concerned about the SCLC. Ernest filed a report that day about a speech that James Bevel had made at Lemoyne College. It was viewed by the FBI as being very inflammatory. He supposedly was endorsing the Black Power movement. These men around him are young militants who were, you know, very much part of the Black Power movement, and so this really got the FBI worked up. I mean, and having these pictures, there were numbers of pictures of Bevel that he took that day and submitted. And it's interesting too that these things have been sitting in FBI files, sealed for 40, 50 years.
It's amazing.
Just to see them. All right, now this is another interesting photo, and really this gets into an area that I would label like a COINTELPRO type operation, even though, I don't know if you all know
What is COINTEL?
COINTELPRO was the FBI's dirty tricks campaign where they would try to undermine or disrupt movements by putting out negative publicity on somebody or trying to disrupt their employment. And these reports were never labeled. The COINTELPRO was an official program that they had, but a lot of the stuff that they were doing, I found, weren't part of the COINTEL program,
Right.
but they were COINTELPRO-like. And this is a good example of it. This lady here is Rosetta Miller. She was an employee of the U.S. Civil Rights Commission in Memphis, which at that time was headquartered there in Memphis. And she was deemed by the local FBI as being too sympathetic with the militant movement. And so they start getting reports on her from Ernest, and Ernest tells them that she's the kind who will give aid and comfort to, the militant movement, and also passes on a rumor that says that she's, basically low character. She had a 1 week marriage, with, I interviewed her recently. She's a very nice lady, but they got her to take, this is the picture that he took too. They wanted the identification. They wanted to be able to say, this is her, and who knows how they would plan to use this eventually. But one of the things is that she and her coworker both contend that the FBI tried to get them fired from their jobs at the U.S. Civil Rights Commission. Bobby Doctor,
Right.
who I've interviewed extensively about this, and he's maintained this for years, not just now when this has come out. Bobby Doctor, who was a field worker for the U.S. Civil Rights Commission, says the FBI, they were in the same building in downtown Memphis, delivered like an inch-thick report on his activities. He was deemed too sympathetic to the militant movement, wanted him fired. They actually got pictures of Bobby Doctor, and we don't have the picture yet, but it's in the files, and I hope we get the picture, because a lot of these pictures are referenced, but Lord knows where they are.
So here's an illustration of their concern about the Nation of Islam.
Yeah, let me just finish about Bobby Doctor.
Oh, sure.
Ernest Withers got a picture of Bobby Doctor holding hands with another woman, evidently at some rally, and I've interviewed him about him, and he knew her, but they're saying, they note in the report that they're both married to other people. They're not married to each other. What they were going to do with the photo, you can only surmise. I don't know. We haven't been able to track all that down, but they were very much after him, and he was a government employee who they deemed too close to the militant movement. This photo here is of I'm trying to remember this guy's name, Bolden Eugene Lawson is his name, and he was a young cleric for the Nation of Islam. This is taking us back to 1961 when they first became active. They opened a mosque, a makeshift mosque in South Memphis, and again, I mean, Ernest would go in there, take the pictures. He'd have flip it over. He'd have the identifications, the names, ages, when he could get them, occupation, that sort of thing. And so
I think it bears adding to, Chuck, before we run out of time.
Sure.
What a remarkable, unintended but remarkable historical archive.
Yeah.
The FBI created.
Yeah.
Now, some of this, thanks to Mark and Scripps, we now have. But this is just one part of a much larger iceberg that the government still has, and particularly in the informant context, where the Bureau and the Justice Department's position is that they'll protect some of these facts of government activity forever, you know, there's the danger that big pieces of American history the government never wants to have told.
And you know, that's interesting because this next coupling of photos, let's stay on this one for a minute, will show you how the efforts of Mark and litigation can kind of lower the waterline so you can see more of that iceberg. This is a picture that contains no faces, obviously, and it has the notation B7C and B6. Those are notations for privacy interests in FOIA litigation. And so as an initial matter, Mark, you did not get to see the faces of these people, is that right?
Not initially, because what happened was this file came from the FBI. This was the Nation of Islam file was one that had not been accessioned to NARA, and so under this deal we worked out, the FBI agreed to release it. So the FBI, sometime earlier this year, released this photo and other photos from what Ernest Withers was taking of the Nation of Islam, and they redacted every name and every face. And we got upset about that, and Chuck made a call to Betsy at the Justice Department, and we eventually got NARA, the National Archives, to re-release the photo.
Now here's the photo we got. Not amazing?
And there it is. NARA is much more accommodating and doesn't take this strict interpretation, I found, to the same degree that the
Well,
FBI
you know,
does.
and also you've mentioned her by name, Betsy Shapiro, two other lawyers worth noting on the Department of Justice side, Wendy Doty, Leslie Farby. You know, litigation doesn't get resolved in mediation without willing participants, people who come to the table in good faith. And I will say, in my experience litigating for many years against the Department of Justice, we've never seen a real effort to come to the table in good faith as much as we did with these lawyers from the Department of Justice and their FBI counterparts. We don't have to get into all the detail of what we talked about, but there were a lot of nice things said to Mark in recognition about the importance of his work. Let me give a quick shout out also to Christine Waltz of my law firm and Drew Shankman, two of the hardworking media lawyers at Holland and Knight, who were very involved in our side of the litigation and who put together late at night, huddled over research materials, the papers that led to all of this. There is one aspect of this story that also came out in the papers that we received, Mizell, that we might want to just spend a minute talking about. If we could take a look in this, I'm sorry, I jumped ahead for a second, just to show you, these are some of the works and the stories that Mark has produced as a result. Maybe we'll come back to that as our closer. But Mizell, there's one series of documents that actually came out in this litigation about the commercial appeal, your newspaper, your company's newspaper, Mark's newspaper, back in the 1960s, and its cooperation with the FBI. What is the Scripps' attitude on that?
Well, actually, what you had there were reporters from the Press Scimitar, which was the Scripps-owned newspaper in Memphis during that period of time, as well as the Commercial Appeal, which at that time was not owned by Scripps, that were deemed friendly by the FBI. The reporters for the newspaper were pursuing stories on the Black Power movement and other activities. And in the documents, their work was characterized as being sympathetic to the interests of the FBI, and that sources within the newspaper were giving information to the FBI.
And so there's a lot to be learned in retrospect on
Well,
this issue.
you know, there are a couple of things to really consider here. One is, you know, both Mark and David have both commented about the wide network of people in and around Memphis who were giving information to authorities, and this extensive human intelligence network that had been created. And the documents revealed that journalists were also, some journalists were also part of that network. And I think that's a story that needs to be told, and needs to be told in much more detail, and it will in the future.
And Memphis wasn't unique.
Absolutely.
One can see the same thing, not as well documented. St. Louis, Birmingham. So again, there's a bigger iceberg out there than what we so far know.
And when we look at, and when we consider that period of time in our history, journalists in many cases were part of the local establishment.
Yes.
Watergate was the tipping point where the more adversarial style of journalism came about, and you saw a lot of journalists recoil at the relationships that had been commonplace in the 60s.
Well, it took good faith coming to the table, and Mark being able to be persuaded that he could tell his story and tell Ernest Wither's story in the fullness that he could. It also took some kind of discussion about money, is that right, Dave? Because this was an expensive lawsuit.
Yes, it was expensive litigation, and there were times when the folks paying the bills were asking a lot of questions about where we were headed, what it was going to cost, and with Mark's help and with sturdy leadership both at the newspaper and with folks like Mizell, we were able to stay focused on the goal, which was to gather up this information. I think some of the rulings that we had along the way that gave us a hope that we were headed in the right direction also kept us interested in moving forward, and a belief that the ultimate goal was worth the cost in the end. Now, granted, we were reimbursed about 80% of our legal fees, so that helped in the end, but I think the focus during the litigation was more on doing the right thing and getting the information than it was on the cost.
I think that's a real important point as we think about the state of the media and the expense of litigating cases like this. But even when you take it down to the local level, there are opportunities for media organizations to recover portions, and in some cases all of their legal fees, if they happen to be, if they emerge from those battles victoriously. And I think that tends to be forgotten by some media companies when when we're looking at really our business being remade as we speak.
Oh, absolutely. Well, we've been talking for a couple of hours now, and we wanted to make sure that we just gave you all an opportunity. Do people have some questions for the panel? All right. We're going to pass a microphone around. Would you, when you pose your question, would you state your name, and if you have an affiliation or an organization, please let us know who that is. We'll start with this Christine, if we could start with this lady in the second row over here.
Yes, my name is Dorothy Gilliam. I'm a former reporter of the Washington Post. I actually worked with Ernest Withers on a story while I was with the Post. So my question to you is, one of my questions was going to be how far back you saw this work, and the fact that he actually worked back, starting back in '58, was another shock to me tonight. Did you find any indication that he reported on the reporters with whom he worked to the FBI?
Well, yes. And I'm going to have to pull this out of the recesses of my mind here, but I think, does the name Carl Blois ring a bell?
It does to me. It's hard to, yeah.
I think he's still around. I apologize. I mean, there's so much information that I've gathered. He was a journalist. I believe he worked for. I don't want to say this wrong. Maybe the Daily Worker. Is that possible?
It's one of the lefty political papers. That's exactly right.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I recognize it as.
And
a
there were
byline.
others like that. There was, boy, this is just. There was a lady who worked for the New York Amsterdam News who made a trip through Memphis. I can get you her name later, who Ernest reported on when she came through. I can't remember the name. They were concerned because of her political views. And they were down there, her and her husband. Her husband was some wealthy real estate executive or something, and they were down there to essentially survey the state of integration, and for some reason or other, she really got the FBI worked up.
Dorothy, you worked with Ernest Withers on a story?
Yes. I was assigned by the Post to go to write aspects of the story on integration of University of Mississippi.
Fantastic.
In fact, I'm writing a book now, so I don't want to tell
Great.
you much.
Sure.
But the point was, yes, I worked with him because I had come to know him several years before.
Fantastic. That's great.
This is very shocking.
Any more questions, please? We had some more hands up. This lady over. Okay, let's take one from over there.
With the length of time that this went on, and surely, you have some intelligent, educated people in the FBI, and the depth at which they were looking at this movement, did you find any evidence that anybody stepped back at some point and said, these people are pushing for legitimate civil rights in the United States. That's the real thrust of the movement, no matter what little side things are going on. Did anybody say that?
Oh yeah, they did. There was a businessman in Memphis, a white businessman who ran a car dealership, John T. Fisher, and he was one who was deemed too sympathetic to the movement, in particular the militant wing of the movement. And he shows up in different reports. He passed on recently, but I've interviewed him, and others have too. And he talks, he's very adamant about the FBI coming to him and trying to lean on him. He shows up in reports as, like, offering jobs to young activists, and they were trying to disrupt this movement. They didn't like that, and he was one who really stood up and said, we're not doing anything wrong here. I mean, I think the priests at St. Patrick's were like that too. I mean, they were anti-war. They were, pro-people. They had this urban outreach.
Was there anybody within the FBI?
The FBI.
Was there anybody within the FBI considering the amount of surveillance they had?
Well, Betty Lawrence has told me that her father was actually very pro-civil rights. I don't see that. One of the things about the FBI is that they never saw themselves as being anti-civil rights. What they were trying to do, what their agenda was, is to keep the country stable, investigate unrest. And even when we were sitting down in mediation, they referred to these as criminal investigations. It's like they kind of veered off course, though, these abuses. And so I don't think that they, within the FBI, saw what they were doing. They were protecting the country. That was their view. And like a lot of it got out of hand, but that's what they saw themselves doing. They were trying to keep law and order. There was a lot, in the context too, from the mid-'60s, there were, a lot of big riots in the big cities, which really, a lot of the activism was going on. That was one thing that they were fearful of, was, this, disturbance and destruction of property, loss of life.
I think in the larger context, beyond just the Memphiss story, the fundamental answer to the question you pose is no. That within the Bureau, there was no culture of tolerating, never mind welcoming, any sort of dissent. And I think that's going to be true in any sort of police or intelligence agency. We've seen some examples in recent years that we don't have time to go into here at all, of whistleblowers from within some government intelligence agencies who have been criminally prosecuted and convicted for daring to dissent from that organizational mission consensus. You find a few field agents back in this day who, in retrospect, acknowledge they had private doubts about the rightness of this, but they, without exception, say, I kept my mouth shut.
Do you, Mark, and you and I have had some conversations about this, what motivated Ernest Withers? There was the money, we now know, but was there something else that plays into this whole mission
Yeah, I think
idea?
he like so many people, when you look at, you know, major events in your life, he had mixed motives. We'll never know precisely what they were, but I mean, money was a factor. He had 8 children to feed, and in fact, my original source told me that that's what it was. It was about the money, but he wanted to be a cop. I mean, that was his lifelong goal. In fact, he was a cop twice. No, actually 3 times. He was a Memphis police officer in 1948 to 51 and wound up getting fired for taking kickbacks. And then, of course, he was a state policeman in the late 70s, and he went to prison for that. He was also elected as Shelby County Constable, which is this unpaid, you know, position that really didn't everything. He almost, when Jimmy Carter became president, he was on a short list to be nominated for U.S. Marshal in Memphis. And so this is one of the things that he probably wanted to be a cop more than he wanted to be a photographer. It just didn't work out for him. But so that was it. Law enforcement interested him. It was the money, and also he was a conservative guy. I mean, he was from a different generation. He fought in World War II. And so when a lot of this, you know, unrest coming on, he very much supported the NAACP approach, you know, which is litigation, the whole, you know, direct action thing and the mass marching and how it all, I mean, I think he was opposed to that, and he was a conservative, so that factors into it
There may
too.
have been a nobility of patriotism or something. that
Exactly.
came
I think
into
he was
his mind.
patriotic.
Yeah.
He definitely was.
Fascinating. More questions? How about somebody over here?
Hi, Carol Gunsberg, and I'm with Scripps Howard News Service here. Just a simple question. I wondered what your relationship is, or whether you've heard from the Withers family, and to the extent that they might acknowledge Mr. Withers' involvement with the FBI, and how much they've expanded on what he did or didn't do.
We don't really talk. I mean, they were very angry with me for a long time. I did have a civil conversation with Roz Withers, his daughter, about a year ago. You know, as I've told her, I don't think that this in any way diminishes Ernest's legacy. I mean, I think anything that you look at the seminal photos he took of the civil rights movement, getting that message out and helping to publicize it, it trumps all this. It's just kind of this hidden history that, you know, we had to bring out. Their position has morphed over time. It was initially denial. I mean, you're making this up, you know, it's, you know, to now they've accepted it in a way. The last time I heard any published comments from her, she basically said that he took photos for the FBI just as he took photos for other clients. It's kind of the position they've settled on in this. Of course, he did a lot more than that. I mean, he provided a lot of, you know, oral intelligence that was put into reports and whatnot. But I mean, the position has morphed over time.
Gene, let's wait for a microphone.
I'm Gene Polisinski with the First Amendment Center. About a year and more ago, I think in Nashville, there were some family members, and they raised an aspect of motivation, now that you've touched on it, which was the coercive presence of the FBI in visiting Ernest Withers when it started. And you may have heard this from different family members, that even though you've cited some money that came in, it was over a long period of time, that he basically had this family photo business, that it wasn't hand to mouth, but that, you know, there was an economic pressure there with a large family, and that there was, if not a direct and implied, you know, you can be with us or you can be against us kind of a thing. And I'm just curious, that was pre any of these documents that you've read. And I'm not giving any credence to that particular theory, but just curious whether any of that's been touched on in anything you've read so far.
Yeah, I've heard that. And as a matter of fact, the story, one of the sons said, is that an FBI agent came in and basically tore up Ernest's studio one day and was yelling at him, telling him, I don't believe it. I don't think it's true. When you look at the close, friendly association that Bill Lawrence had with Ernest Withers, he brought Ernest into his home, and they took Christmas photos of his family. When Bill Lawrence testified before Congress, somebody, I think it was Walter Fauntroy, asked him on, you know, when he was testifying, whether, you know, he'd ever flipped some, you know, criminal defendant as an informant. He says, I've never done that in my life. He worked in a different world. Now, I mean, I don't. He was a domestic security guy, and he would go out and he would recruit people. He was a salesman for the FBI. One of the ways that he recruited Vasco Smith from the NAACP was they both had a deep interest in jazz, and he sold that to bring him on board. So I've heard that story. I don't believe it. I don't think it's true.
Good question. Question in the back, Sophia.
Hi, I'm Sophia Cope with the Newspaper Association of America, and EW Scripps is a member of ours, so I'm really happy to hear that you guys pursued this story and this litigation. Mark, I'm wondering, what documents do you still want, and do you think the FBI will sort of voluntarily give them to you, or do you think that further litigation will be necessary?
Well, that's a good question, and there are, as I'm going through these records, there are references to a lot of photos, I alluded to this earlier, that aren't part of the public domain yet and may never ever become part of the public domain. And for example, some of the early pictures that Ernest took at Tent City were of James Foreman, who at that time, this was early, 1961, the records show that he was selling the FBI, he sold them 7 pictures of James Foreman for $1 each. And it wasn't worked out yet. He didn't get coded as ME338R until later in the relationship. They tried to make him a full-fledged paid informant early on. He couldn't pass the reliability standard because of what happened with the Memphis Police Department, so they made him the next best thing, which was a confidential source, which was, he was an informant, they just called him something else and they had a different arrangement. But there's lots of references to photos he took of Fannie Lou Hamer. We don't have them. Where are they? I mean, just lots of people, you know, that it would be interesting if somehow there was some mechanism where you could get your arms around this sort of litigating and fighting, you know, but I don't know what that is.
Gentleman in the front, get a microphone up here, please.
Hi, my name's Tony Deaconus. We've talked.
Yes.
I worked with Ernest from 1990 and acted as his agent. I was totally blown out of the water when I saw the breadth of the work that he had done. What I find really interesting is you're referring to those pictures of the Nation of Islam, the Defenders. It's too bad you don't have a better working relationship with the family, because all of those negatives are accessible. All of those prints are accessible. They were, you know what, I think Ernest saw an opportunity, perhaps, working with the FBI to double dip. You presented a story where Ernest posed as a journalist. He was a journalist. And those photographs, the March Against Fear, Tent City, those, I put money on the table that those pictures were published in many of the African American dailies. And if the FBI were to supplement his income to pay more, Ernest would have taken it. You know, he needed the money, but and I think this is why the family's upset, is because you make a statement that Ernest Withers was an FBI informant. Well, that's a lot of baggage. And I haven't heard anything about real substantive harm that Ernest caused any individuals other than this innuendo that he was an FBI informant. Did he somehow slander people? Pictures of Fannie Lou Hamer, he's got dozens of them. James Farmer, dozens of them, some of which have been exhibited in museums and in galleries around the country. What was he hiding? There was nothing to hide. If somebody wanted a picture, you knew about this for a long time, Mark. Why didn't you go talk to him? Ernest loved to talk about his life, including some of these horrendous mistakes he made.
Mm-hmm. I did talk to him. We didn't talk specifically about that. This didn't come out until after he died. As I said earlier, I never envisioned that I was going to write this story once, you know, my original source wasn't going to go on the record on that. But I mean, as far as the possible harm, I mean, when you get, there are areas that, you know, we discussed about, you know, the COINTELPRO type operations that they were doing. The workers at the U.S. Civil Rights Commission, Rosetta Miller, Bobby Doctor, you know, taking pictures of them, showing them holding hands, the FBI trying to get them fired. I mean, there's a whole nother dimension to this. The Catholic priests, I mean, what were they doing? I mean, they were just doing an urban outreach ministry. And so, I mean, you're right to a point. I mean, there was this kind of this double dipping. A lot of these photos were published, some weren't. I think probably, you know, as we get more, we're finding more weren't. But there was that other element. There was that other element of the dirty tricks that were going on, the abuses that really reach further. And I think, again, I mean, I don't think it will diminish his legacy as an important documentarian of the civil rights movement, but I think it adds another dimension where you really have to question what he was doing.
Yeah. And in instances beyond Mr. Withers, this pattern is the same thing, that the human informants are crucial to the FBI's ability to do all of these personally harmful, dirty tricks, whether it's the Communist Party, whether it's people working in SCLC headquarters. One often retrospectively hears this excuse of, oh, you know, I wasn't, my father, my husband, whoever the informant was, wasn't trying to harm anyone. Sorry, that is unacceptably naive. This was a system of police intelligence designed to harm people whose politics the FBI found offensive and imaginably dangerous.
I'll also add, thank you for your contribution, by the way. I think you added a very important voice to today's discussion. I'll also note that the story is still ongoing. The commercial appeal is still reporting on this story, and I'm sure they would welcome any and all input that anybody, you, the Withers family, or anybody wants to provide as they continue to report this story. I'm not speaking out of school, I would hope, for the commercial appeal, but I do appreciate your comments. Anybody else have any questions? All right, why don't we call it a wrap, and by thanking our panel for a great discussion today.
And special thanks, if I may, special thanks on behalf of everyone to Chuck Tobin for pulling this together and shepherding it.
My pleasure, and thanks to the National Press Club as well. And in addition to that print work, he was senior advisor to PBS for the award-winning series Eyes on the Prize, which documented a series of milestone events in the civil rights movement. He currently serves on the faculty of University of Pittsburgh, holding dual appointments in both law and the Department of History, and he's previously taught at a number of other esteemed institutions, including American University here in the Washington, D.C. area. And then finally, helping us round out the discussion, on my far right is Mizell Stewart, Vice President for Content with the newspaper group at E.W. Scripps. E.W. Scripps is based in Cincinnati. In that job, Mizell oversees the editors in Scripps' 13 newspaper platforms, helping them develop content strategy, news and information production across both their print and digital platforms. He came to that job at Scripps through Scripps' Evansville Courier and Press newspaper, where he was the editor for 5 years. Previous to that, he served editorial positions in the newsrooms at the Akron Beacon Journal and the Biloxi Sun Herald. And Mizell also led the team at the Tallahassee Democrat, but way back in the year 2000, over their award-winning coverage of the election recount in Florida, which is actually where I had the privilege of meeting and working with Mizell. And so we have with us a full panel of people ready to delve into all of the different stories and main bars and sidebars. And to start it all off, I thought maybe we would dress the table with the historical setting. And so let me ask David Garrow, we're here to talk about Ernest Withers and the FBI. Let's talk about the FBI first. What were they doing domestically in the 1960s?
I think the first thing to emphasize about the FBI's domestic security efforts in the 50s and 60s is that human informants were far and away the major building block. Back in those decades, electronic surveillance, either wiretaps or microphones, were exceptionally time-consuming and relatively expensive to operate. So it's only...
Good evening, everyone. My name is John Donnelly, and I am the chairman of the National Press Club's Press Freedom Committee, and by day I'm a reporter for CQ Roll Call. I want to welcome you to tonight's event, which is entitled Double Exposure, and we're going to tell the story of how the Memphiss commercial appeal newspaper unearthed the extraordinary tale of Ernest Withers, who was a famous photographer of the civil rights movement and at the same time an informant for the FBI. Tonight's event is brought to you by the Press Club's Press Freedom Committee and also by our Young Members Committee. The Press Freedom Committee, if I may just tell you for a moment, spearheads the Press Club's efforts to fight back against repression of the press, both here at home and abroad. And we also push hard to make sure that governments everywhere are as open to the public as possible. And if you're interested in joining the club or just learning more about us, the website is press.org. Now, tonight's event is especially timely because of what it says about how newspapers, even as their business models feel intense pressure, can still do public interest journalism that takes a long time and costs a bit of money. It's also timely because of what it says about the importance of freedom of information laws in that pursuit, and not least because it touches on government surveillance of citizens in a democracy, which is also a very timely subject. And we could not have a more perfect moderator for tonight's panel than Chuck Tobin, who is the gentleman sitting in the middle here. I'm going to introduce Chuck to you and get out of the way. Chuck's a former journalist who now chairs a nationwide team of media lawyers at the firm of Holland and Knight, and he's based here in Washington, D.C. Chuck's a member of the club's Press Freedom Committee. He's a former chair of the American Bar Association's and the D.C. Bar Association's media law committees. He was also lead counsel.
In relatively unusual cases with Dr. King, some of Dr. King's advisors, Elijah Muhammad, head of the Nation of Islam. Only in very unusual cases did the FBI go to the effort and the cost of mounting widespread electronic surveillance. So human informants were the bread and butter of the FBI's domestic security coverage, whether it's the American Communist Party, the Socialist Workers' Party, the Nation of Islam, the Civil Rights Movement. And agents in every office were tasked with recruiting human informants. And that tasking had a statistical, measure up element to it. Now, it bears emphasis, without treading on what Mark's going to talk about, that the vast majority of these human informants whom the FBI recruited were not paid. And certainly in a good number of civil rights movement instances, these individuals didn't realize that the Bureau viewed them and coded them in the FBI's numeric filing system as informants. And in multiple instances that I've encountered in years past, someone who was a minister in Montgomery, Alabama, would recall, oh yes, the FBI agents would come and talk to me every month or so about what was going on. And certainly in, say, the mid or late 1950s in the Deep South, a lot of people in the movement thought of the FBI as potentially helpful and supportive of the movement. They weren't at that time viewing the Bureau as this hostile force.
Well, indeed, we've all seen the film of federal agents helping to integrate the schools in the South against the resistance that was there. Where did this notion that the civil rights movement in the mind of the FBI going on in the FBI and in the civil rights movement during the 1960s and early 1970s? So to tell this story and to tell these sidebars, we've assembled a panel of direct players and other interested people. The most important player on the main bar of this story is Mark Pereskia with the Commercial Appeal newspaper. Mark's superb work is what told us all about Ernest Withers, and he's actually been pursuing this story, as he'll tell you, since 1997, which is a colossally long time for such a young journalist as Mark to have been pursuing this story, and he's done a very good job at that. Mark has been with the Commercial Appeal for 24 years. Prior to that, he did tours of duty in the newsrooms at the Duluth News-Tribune in Minnesota and the Bradenton Herald in Florida, and he's a proud graduate of the University of Minnesota. To my right is David Giles. Dave Giles is Vice President and Deputy General Counsel and Chief Ethics Officer at the E.W. Scripps Company. Dave is the secret weapon and best friend to all of Scripps' newsrooms across its platform of 13 newspaper and 19 broadcast and the internet platform markets. He is the first call when journalists have a legal problem and a legal issue, and he counsels and helps them work through problems, and where appropriate, brings in outside counsel to help them get the news out. Dave is perfectly suited for that work because before he joined Scripps, in fact, before he became a lawyer, he was a reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer and USA Today, and so he feels their pain. He knows what they go through. And between his newsroom work and joining Scripps, he also was a very prominent litigation attorney here in the Washington, D.C. market. Also joining us today on my far left is historian David Garrow. David Garrow is both a historian and a Pulitzer Prize-winning author of the book Bearing the Cross, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, among other important works of history that he's written. He frequently writes on the civil rights movement for the New York Times, The Nation, the Financial Times, and the New Republic.
For the Memphiss Commercial Appeal in the litigation against the FBI over the Ernest Withers files. And that's all I have to say. So let me just be a smart guy and turn it over to the panel. Chuck?
Thank you, John. It's an honor and a privilege to be here, and we all give our thanks to the National Press Club's Freedom of the Press Committee and the Young Members Committee for hosting this panel. You see on the screens a picture of Ernest Withers. Ernest Withers, as John told you and as everybody who came here knows, Ernest Withers was a noted photographer in Memphis, and at the same time, thanks to the intrepid work of our panel member next to me, we also now know at the same time that he was given access and the trust of the leadership of the civil rights movement, he was also informing on the movement to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And that is the what, and there are a lot of questions about the why, questions you have, questions we have, questions that we want to find the answers to. And part of the panel discussion tonight is to focus on the story of who Ernest Withers was and why he became involved in the story in this particular way. But as my friends in print journalism would say, that's really just the main bar of this whole story. There are lots of sidebars. And tonight we're going to discuss some of those sidebars as well. There's the story of the Freedom of Information Act litigation that Mark and the Memphiss Commercial Appeal brought, and how the FOIA process really worked to our advantage to help tell this story. There's the story of the Scripps Company, the E.W. Scripps Company, which owns the Commercial Appeal. And as John noted in introducing me, in this day and age, it's highly unusual and indeed courageous for newspaper companies to be spending precious resources on investigations and litigation like this. And then finally, in any big story, there's a why do we care? There's a social and historical context. And we're going to delve into that context today and try and put Ernest Withers into part of the historical mosaic of what was